So if you can think back to before the Lubert's family dynasty, which was wonderful, we were, back before life got interesting, working through a mini-series on law and covenant in the Bible. And in the... you don't hear that every day, I gotta say. In the first sermon, we focused on what the law did for the Israelites, as Christiana remembered astonishingly. And not just the exciting stuff, like regulations concerning mildew, and beautiful, eloquent, poetic statements about the cleanliness of male pattern baldness. But we also saw on that morning how the law turned these newly escaped slaves into a people, into a nation, again, as Christiana said, a nation that was so unlike any of the ancient Near Eastern cultures that surrounded them on every side. That was the first sermon. In the second sermon, we zoomed out. You might recall we started by zooming out in that picture book. And we saw that, in fact, all those important nation-shaping laws weren't the main thing that Moses brought down from the top of Mount Sinai. Yes, the Ten Commandments loom large in our imagination and in the Israelite imagination, but those commandments were only one part of something much bigger. And that something bigger was this thing we call the covenant, which was a relationship, a kind of relationship known in the ancient Near East. And it was a relationship that God initiated with the Israelites. That was the main thing. The truth is that second sermon, it was a bit of a doozy. It was complicated and a bit lengthy, and I kept zooming out, and I couldn't stop. And by the end, we were considering just the shape of all reality. But those of you who were here, I have to sort of acknowledge, you hung in there, and I think the main point still got through, which is that the law is just part of a bigger picture, and that is the covenant initiated by God for the benefit of the Israelites, for the flourishing of the Israelites. And the Israelites were invited into that relationship, not forced into it. And it was designed to lead to love and delight and shalom, that Hebrew word that means the rightness and good health of all your relationships. Not emptiness and darkness and anxiety, which was often the case with the other ancient Near Eastern worldviews. So this morning's sermon is the third, and it will be simpler than the zoom out, and I think a bit shorter. There's just one main idea this morning, and it comes from the highly regarded Old Testament scholar John Walton, who wrote, among many other books, a book called simply Covenant, which seems pretty relevant. In his book, using a writing style that maybe could be more dry, with a lot of effort, John Walton lists many different theological understandings of the purpose of the Old Testament covenant, how the covenant fits into God's overall plan, and he deals with pages and pages and chapters, all the different ways that different scholars fit the covenant into their systematic theologies. And if you hang in there, it's worth it, because it's really dry until John Walton proposes something else. Something simple, something that makes you think, oh, maybe it's all about relationship and not systems, theological systems. And here's the simple idea. John Walton thinks the primary function of the covenant was simply to reveal God, to show the Israelites who God is. Now that might not sound like much, but remember that the primary thing Moses brought down from the top of Mount Sinai was the offer of a relationship. And remember that the normal ancient Near Eastern worldview, we talked about this in the first sermon of this little series, the default setting that was quote-unquote normal, everywhere the Israelites went, was the understanding that the gods, plural, were self-centered, unfaithful, unpredictable, quick to anger, and full of revenge. These are not the kinds of beings you want with you in a close relationship. These are the kinds of beings you want to keep distant, do just enough to stop them from getting angry. So when Moses showed up with God's covenant, with a relationship, the question for the Israelites, understandably, was the title of the sermon: relationship? Relationship with whom? And that question is important in any relationship, really, at any time. But for the Israelites at that moment, it was crucial, especially considering what gods were like. And John Walton proposes that it was the covenant itself, as the Israelites learned more about it, and as they lived in it, and as they were shaped by it, it was the covenant that taught them about the character of God, about the heart of God. So this morning, we're just going to listen to a lot of passages, and we're going to pay attention to what the covenant taught the Israelites about God. But before we do, I don't know what to call this, a disclosure or a confession or an acknowledgement, I'm not sure. Every single passage we're going to hear talks about the name of God. And there are two things we need to clarify before we begin. One, Pamela amazingly already hinted at when she kind of improvised up here with that call to worship. In the ancient world, your name did not just mean the sound of your name. It didn't just mean the syllables that people have to pronounce to get your attention. Where you could do fun things like point that way and say, Paul. Name meant so much more than that. It meant your character. It meant who you really are. We actually still have leftovers of that idea when we say something like, oh, look at that, I'm not going to put this back on and hurt myself, but that's not symbolic. We still say something like, well, I guess we could talk about Paul. Paul, he doesn't wear a poppy very long. It just falls right off. He's got a bad name in this town. Right? We say that sort of thing. He's got a bad name. And that is leftover from, that means character. That's what that really means. So all the emphasis on God's name in these passages we're going to hear is really emphasis on God's character. Keep that in mind. But that's not the main thing I wanted to say. The second thing is what I really want to say. We have a significant challenge when we read these passages, especially when we read them aloud from an English translation. And here's the problem. Challenge. In ancient Hebrew, there is a word that means Lord, as in Lord over a servant, Lord and Master. And there's another word that means God. But there's also a third word that I want to talk about, and that's the personal name of God, that God revealed to Moses and to these newly escaped Israelites, and that personal name is Yahweh. But for a long time, for over 2,000 years now, many Jews have avoided saying the personal name of God out of respect. So when they read aloud in the synagogue, and when they come to that personal name, they don't say Yahweh, they say Lord, or my Lord, or sometimes the name. And that old tradition of saying Lord instead of the personal name, it made its way into other translations through the centuries. So by the time we get to our English Bibles, the Hebrew word for God is translated God, and that's good. And the Hebrew word for Lord is translated Lord, also good. But the Hebrew word Yahweh, the personal name of God, is also translated Lord. So when God's trying to say something personal to the Israelites, we English readers miss it. Now, those two lords, when I speak them, sound exactly the same. But on the printed page, in defense of the English Bible publishers, on the printed page it does look a little different. When it's Yahweh, it's all capital in the English translations. And when it's a normal Lord, it just is a normal looking Lord. So I don't know if you've ever noticed those two lords. The all capital means Yahweh. I'm dwelling on this because we are here in 21st century Canada, and we are growing in our understanding and our awareness that words matter. They can empower, but they can also oppress. And we're doing our best to be aware of how certain words are associated with things like racism and misogyny and cultural appropriation and all sorts of things like this, and we want to be sensitive, and that's good. So here's our situation. I'm about to read aloud passages where God really wants to share God's personal name with the Israelites. God really wants the Israelites to grow in their understanding of what that name means in terms of character. If I try to be sensitive to observant Orthodox Jews, I might avoid saying that personal name. If I try to be sensitive to the pain caused by millennia of toxic patriarchy, I might also want to avoid saying Lord. Because for some, that term conjures up images of a male overlord, just a buffoon exercising dominion over whatever. If I do what some do and say just the name instead of Yahweh, then we'd end up with sentences that sound like this. Then you will know me by my name. The name. Which loses, I think, some of the original punch, you know? So with fear and trembling up here, aware that there is no perfect choice for me, and in the interest of trying to make the original story come alive, I am going to be saying the name Yahweh this morning. And I don't do it lightly, and I do it with all respect, but I think for us it is more true to the powerful and astonishing fact that God wanted to reveal God's name and character to the Israelites in a shockingly personal way. So, much of God's self-revelation to the Israelites occurs through Moses. So this morning, given the limitations of time, that's what I've decided to just limit us to. So we're just going to stick to what was revealed to the Israelites during the lifetime of Moses, and especially what was revealed in connection with God's personal name. That's the little slice this morning. So let's start with that name, revealed to Moses at the burning bush. As you may recall, Moses did not come off well in that interview with God at the burning bush. God had heroic plans for Moses, who was already acting like a kind of a Batman vigilante on his spare time. But Moses just made up a series of weak excuses and did not want to do it. Here's one of the weak excuses. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'Oh yeah, what is God's name?' What shall I tell them?" And God said to Moses, this is famous, you've heard this before, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites. "I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob, has sent me to you. This, Yahweh, is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." So a couple of things about that little episode. God starts, as you heard, by identifying as I am. Just so you know, the Hebrew phrase actually means both I am and I will be, equally. There's a double meaning, and it's like God is saying, who I am now, I will also be in the future. There is a staying power to my character, Moses, a staying power to the person I am, as you will discover. I am now who I will be, and I will be then who I am now. And that's the beautiful thing about Hebrew. So often, just one word is a poem all on its own. Layers of meaning. But that's God talking about God. Moses can't really say that exact same thing to the Israelites, because if everybody went around saying, I am, it would be very confusing. So God gives Moses a third person version. Okay, so maybe everybody else knows this, and I'm the last one. I always feel like that. But I just learned this week that Yahweh literally means He is. And He will be. It's just a third-person version of I am. He is. He will be. And I apologize for the male pronouns there, but that's literally what it means in the Hebrew language. Yahweh. It means God is. God will be. But again, for the Israelites, the obvious question is, God is what? God will be what? And so we're going to keep going and see how those questions are answered over the next 40 years of Israelite history. So buckle up, just 40 years of history. Here we go. A little bit later, Moses does return to Egypt and has his first conversation with Pharaoh, asking, I've always found this a bit odd. Like the first thing Moses says to Pharaoh is an out-and-out lie. We just want to go on a little field trip and meet God at this one mountain, and then we'll come right back. Well, Pharaoh sees right through that, gets really mad, and then makes life even worse for the Israelite slaves. Nobody is happy. It's a horrible start. Moses gets very discouraged and basically tells God, this plan ain't working. In response, and now I'm reading from Exodus, God said to Moses, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. But I did establish my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. Therefore, tell the Israelites that I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. And that, by the way, is a covenant formula. You will be my people, and I will be your God. That's covenant talk right there. Then you will know that I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out from the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I promised to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you. I am Yahweh. Notice how often the name Yahweh is repeated in all those promises. It's repeatedly connected with loving care, with promises kept, with dependable character. I will free you. I will redeem you. I will be your God. I will give you the land. I am Yahweh. Well, we know, after many miraculous signs and horrible plagues, the Israelites did escape Egypt and cross the Red Sea, but it only took a few days before they got very thirsty in the desert and began to complain. So God provided clean water and reassured the Israelites with these words, I won't bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you. So that's good. But once the water problem got fixed, that meant they revived enough to complain about the food. So Yahweh said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. So tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am Yahweh, your God. So, relationship with whom? What is Yahweh like? I am Yahweh who heals you. I am Yahweh who will fill you with meat and bread, and then you will know. So eventually, the Israelites do make it to Mount Sinai. Moses went up to the top, and about a month later he came back down with the covenant, and that covenant included some laws, as we know. And I am going to read to you this morning Not the best known version of the laws that came down from the top of Mount Sinai, which is the Ten Commandments, but another version of the laws that Moses brought down. This is found in a section in Leviticus. And I really want us to notice that especially the laws about taking care of the vulnerable, the laws about loving your neighbor, those laws are punctuated with the tagline. And the tagline is, I am Yahweh. Which tells us, I think, a lot about God's priorities and a lot about God's character. So listen to this. It's a little lengthy. When you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap to the very edges of your field. Don't gather the gleanings of your harvest. Don't go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner. I am Yahweh, your God. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't deceive each other. Do not swear falsely by my name. Again, by my character. Don't swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. Don't defraud your neighbors or rob them. Don't hold back the wages of a hired worker. And here are two practical jokes not to commit. Do not curse the deaf. Do not put a stumbling block in front of the blind. I am Yahweh. These are just great metaphors for picking on someone who's completely vulnerable. Don't pervert justice. Don't show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the rich. But judge your neighbor fairly. Don't go about spreading slander among the people. Don't do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am Yahweh. Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Instead, speak to your neighbor frankly, so you won't share in their guilt. But don't seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but instead, wonder if this sounds familiar, love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. When foreigners reside among you in your land, don't mistreat them. The foreigners residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you too were once foreigners in Egypt. I am Yahweh, your God. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt. Kind of get the sense there, like, I did a lot for you, and you're going to just end up cheating each other? Come on, people. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am Yahweh. I hope you can hear in that passage how I am Yahweh is used to show that God is committed to the poor and to the foreigners and to the vulnerable. I am Yahweh means God values honesty and safety for all and love for neighbor. We are shown when this is connected to God's name and God's character and God's heart, these things matter deeply to God. After that, as is common with a covenant, God lays out for the Israelites, through Moses of course, what will happen if they do keep the laws of the covenant and what will happen if they don't. In both cases, the name Yahweh again features prominently. So let's start with what will happen if they do keep the laws. God says, I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. Here is just a great description of plenty. You will still be eating last year's harvest when you have to move it to make room for the new. I'll put my dwelling place among you, and I will not detest you. I will not despise you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with your heads held high. And then we are told what happens if the Israelites don't keep the laws. And this is where things could, and often did, get pretty harsh in ancient Near Eastern covenant formulas. And sure enough, God does make it clear that there will be unpleasant consequences, and that's laid out. But then we're told that's not the end of the story, because at the end of these consequences, we read this. Again, this is God speaking. My people will pay for their sins because they rejected my laws and abhorred my decrees. And yet, in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or despise them. I will not destroy them completely. I will not break my covenant with them. I am Yahweh, their God. For their sake, I will remember the covenant I made with their ancestors whom I brought out of Egypt. I am Yahweh. So whether they keep the laws or don't, Yahweh says, I will not despise them. And whether they keep the laws or not, I am Yahweh clearly means I will never give up on them. No matter what they do. Now, much later, decades later, as the Israelites were nearing the promised land and Moses was nearing the end of his life, Moses gathered the Israelites and reminded them of all the miracles they had seen during their escape from Egypt and during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And Moses said to them, you were shown all these miraculous things so that you might know that Yahweh is your God. Besides Yahweh, there is no other. Acknowledge and take to heart, know in your heart this day that Yahweh is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. Keep God's decrees and commands, which I'm giving you this day. Why? So that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and so that you may live long in the land that Yahweh gives you. So in this passage, I am Yahweh means that the one and only uncontested God is the God of love. The God who wants it to go well with us, say the Israelites. And a little bit later in the same speech, we then come to the passage that Pamela read to us already this morning. Moses says this, Yahweh did not set affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all the peoples. But it was because Yahweh loved you and kept the promise to your ancestors. It was because of that Yahweh brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery. Know, therefore, says Moses in a kind of a closing statement to the Israelites, know that Yahweh, your God, is God. Yahweh is the faithful God, keeping the covenant of love to 1,000 generations. And again, I just want to remind you of the normal ancient Near Eastern worldview that surrounded the Israelites on every side. I want you to think how far we've come from all of that. How far we've come from gods who are disinterested, self-centered, vicious. Yahweh, the name and character of God, is precisely the opposite of all those things. Surrounded on all sides by ancient Near Eastern cultures, the Israelites were going to need help if they were ever going to learn that. So really, here it is. And maybe I should say, spoiler alert, But the great story of the Old Testament is simply this. God made a covenant with the Israelites to reveal the personal name Yahweh to them, and then spent decades and centuries teaching the Israelites what that meant, what that name meant, and consequently taught them what was at the very heart of all reality. I am. I will be. I am and will be your rescuer, your provider, your redeemer, your healer. I am and will be the protector of the weak, the lover of the outcast, the shepherd who never abandons the sheep. I am and will be the God who loves you, who wants you to find shalom. That is what the covenant taught the Israelites just in those 40 years, with just through the name Yahweh. And because we have that literature in our Bibles, and because we can, in a sense, watch the Israelites learn this, then we can learn it and relearn it too, which we need to do. We need reminding. So relationship with whom? And alongside the Israelites, we have a slightly better sense of the answer. This is the God who calls and loves each and every one of us, each and every day. This is the God who is love. The God who will continue to be love. Amen.